Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. If you've been following the news, you know that Iran has been rocked by protests since the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Today, I'm talking to Jasmine Ramsey. She is the Deputy Director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. This conversation is an important one. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Jasmine. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me and covering this story.
You know, I have been wanting to talk to you about this. It's a huge topic. And I know we're not going to be able to cover everything in the next 25, 30 minutes, but we need to talk about what's happening in Iran right now. And we need to talk about what's happening with women, children, and it's not just women and children. It's really everybody, but specifically women. And, you know, it really came to everyone's attention with the death of Mahsa Amini.
Right. So starting with Mahsa, her real name was Jina. She was of Kurdish descent. So she's from Kurdistan province. These are provinces around Iran that they have different minority groups. And when you are born in Iran, you have to take on a Persian or Islamic name. So they put on Mahsa, but her family called her Jina. She was visiting Tehran with her family. She was 22 years old, and she gets picked up by the morality police. And this is a unit of the police that was established during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was given extreme power to patrol the streets, and really they can harass and detain anyone accused of not complying with the state's dress code. And in the state's interpretation of Islam, women have to cover themselves from head to toe. And so Mahsa was targeted by this group, which has nothing to do with morality and everything to do with repression. They truly are a tool of political repression. And taken in a van and taken to the center, to a place where they basically book these girls, they photograph them, they might make them take a class on how to dress. And typically these girls are let go after they're scared to death so that they never, show too much hair or whatever they've been accused of. But Mahsa wasn't released. She was hospitalized, and just days later she died. And her family believes that she died as a result of being beaten. And they got that information from other girls who were also picked up in the van. They called her family. And so her death really triggered protests around the country. And one way to understand that is one of the chants that we hear is, join us or you'll be the next Mahsa. And that really speaks to the wide range of all facets of society that have joined these protests. They're really led by women, and young women, in some cases girls. But they also have men, they have older, younger, working class, middle class. Every member of society at some point in the last 6 to 7 years has joined protests in Iran. And this one has been the biggest challenge to the Islamic Republic really since 2009. I think that was the last time protests in Iran really had the eye of the world the way that they do now. And that time it was about a contested presidential election. But now, whereas back then the chant was really, where is my vote? Now it's death to the dictator and woman life freedom. So they're equating women's rights with fundamental human rights and all of Iran, and also calling for an end to this dictatorship that is running Iran. So there was some belief in the system back in 2009, and you could really say that that is completely evaporated now. And so now we're seeing mass protests around the streets of Iran, many, many cities all across the country, really demanding serious social and political change.
Okay, so let's back it up first, and then we're going to come back to that, because we're going to come back to this point. You were born in Iran.
Yeah.
Your mother was deeply involved or she was a protester. She has protested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
I'm curious I mean, I'm sure, what do you remember from living in Iran?
Well, I was very young when we
Hmm.
left. It was the Iran-Iraq War. I did go back after that. I can't go back anymore because of the work that I do. But let me just say that when my mom was there, she was one of the first women's groups that helped organize major protests against the compulsory hijab when it was imposed after the revolution. There was sort of two phases in 1979 and 1980. So she helped organize protests against that. Many women in Iran, be they outside or in the diaspora, are very active in expressing dissent and speaking out against what's happening inside Iran. So they all have different ways of doing so. And what happened with my mom is sort of the protest movement is evolving since then. Women all across the country show their dissent in different ways. If you look at the pictures of women in after the revolution, the early years, they really were covered all over. I mean, in dark veils. And since then, women show more and more hair. They have lots of makeup on. They're so creative, and you really see that the most in the youngest generation. And these girls happen to also be at the forefront of these protests and have also been killed. You know, you speak to something that I was hoping to speak about a little bit in your show, just to kind of explain to your viewers about what's happening in Iran. And I think you could look at that through the cases of 4 women that we've covered at the Center for Human Rights in Iran to tell their stories to you. So the first one, of course, is Mahsa Amini, and we just talked about her. Another one is Niloufar Hamedi. She's a journalist. She was working for a newspaper in Iran, and she was the first one that broke the story about Mahsa Amini's death. She's in prison right now. She's among thousands who've been arrested arbitrarily simply for speaking out, for raising their voices, or trying to bring attention to these protests. She just turned 31. So Niloufar is someone who lives in that society, tries to be a journalist, and is among, by the way, 40 journalists at least who've been arrested in just the last 4 weeks so that they can stop them from bringing attention to this story. Then there's Nargis Mohammadi. She's a very prominent human rights activist that's been in the country for all her life and has been in and out of prison as a political prisoner for years and years, simply for saying that women should be allowed to, you know, have the same rights as men and advocating against the death penalty. She's in Evin prison right now. This is a prison that's infamous in Tehran for holding political prisoners. And she and many other political prisoners had their phone cards taken away when these protests happened, because the state wants to not just put them behind bars, but then also block them from being able to talk to people to give them their own insights. So that's Nargis Mohammadi. She's in her 50s. And then we have Gohar Eshqi. She's the mother of Sattar Beheshti, who was a blogger and laborer in 2009, who was arrested during the protests then and died as a result of torture in the prisons. His mother, very humble background, not, you know, highly educated or wealthy or anything like that. And she's worn the hijab all her life in Iran. She recently posted a video talking about what's happening with the youth and how the state is targeting the youth. And then she takes her hijab off and she says, if you're going to use this as an excuse to kill people, then I'm going to take it off. So I think if you look at these protests through the eyes of all these women, there's this common thread that women's bodies are really being used by the state to hold up the ideology of the revolution. And it's failing. People are speaking out against that from every angle, from the religious to the very young to the liberal. Women are just doing everything they can to speak out against it. And so I just thought about bringing those to you. Yeah.
Yes. And I've heard of all of those women and read about all of them. And you mentioned the prison. And that prison was, I mean, we saw that prison on fire just a few weeks ago. It's so violent there right now for women, and has been. You mentioned the revolution, and you know, it's interesting. I remember, like in 1979, I'm way older than you. I was in elementary school, and I remember hearing the Shah of Iran. I remember hearing the Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, I didn't know what any of it meant, but, with my parents watching the news, you hear names and, I just remember being scared and not knowing why I was scared. I think there's a lot of people living in Canada and the US and North America that have no idea what the revolution was and what that means. How would you describe it to somebody they just don't know?
Right. So I think the simplest way to understand the revolution of 1979 in Iran is that many people wanted sovereignty. They believed that their government was being controlled by outside powers. And now we're also hearing the word revolution being put out all the time when we're looking at the protest movement that's evolving in the country. And this time, people are saying that the threat is actually within the country, that it's a government that operates with impunity and no accountability and only for its own survival, and is willing to gun down even children to uphold the state. And that's what people are protesting against. That idea of violence is so common in Iran, simply for speaking out in a way that's critical of the state. There's really no space for people to express themselves or engage in free speech that's critical of the state. There's nowhere. I mean, protests are constantly put down. And yet, no matter how violently that happens, they continue to sprout. And Mahsa's death was one trigger point. The protests ebb and flow, all protest movements do. Until the people's demands are met, certainly there will be more protests.
Is social media their worst nightmare for this? The government's?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this will bring you to the idea of this Generation Z in Iran. So they don't have a direct experience of the war and the revolution, but they've been made to pay for it by a government that worships these events and worships the martyrs of these events and tries to enforce itself and its beliefs on these young people who are also happen to be extremely educated and very well connected to the outside world through their phones and social media. Of course, the internet and social media are very censored in Iran, but Iranians are creative. They find ways to get around it, and they are connected. What I find so interesting is that these Gen Zers have been watching the world and seeing how their lives are so different. Now they've used social media to engage the outside world and to say, look at our lives and look at what we're talking about. And so now it's reversed. The world is watching them. So it's really fascinating to see how that's switched up. And of course, social media absolutely is the government's worst nightmare. That's why the internet continues to be disrupted and blocked. With our contacts in Iran, there's sometimes hours and hours will pass before we see a little check mark that they've actually received our message. And that's happening to everyone that has family inside Iran. They wait for the internet to come back and then not. So just like the internet is in chains in Iran, so are the people. And again, they're still risking everything to speak out against that.
So you mentioned that you can't go back there. And I've heard, I have friends who were born in Iran, and some of them have given interviews in a local magazine or been very vocal on social media. And they've said the same thing because of this news article, because of this post, because I can never go back, at least under this regime. What would it mean for someone like you in the position you're in? You say you can't go back. What would happen to you if you did go back?
Right. So my work is centered around human rights and advocacy and engaging with governments to take a constructive approach to the Iranian government. So that and the fact that I have dual citizenship really puts a target on my back. But more importantly, I think it's important to think about the risks that people inside Iran take. They don't have the protections that I do sitting here speaking so openly to you. And I feel guilt about that every single day because they're so courageous. There's schoolgirls coming up with the most creative ways to not only protest against the state, but then tape it and get it on social media. And The other side is the families of these girls. We have a product on our website called Voices from Iran, because there's a real absence of voices from the ground. And that's mainly because people, as you said, are afraid to speak to big media. So we try to bring some of these voices, either civil society members or just average people that are living their lives. And some things that really stood out to me was one, a humble restaurant worker, 50 years old, said, the state always believed that I was watching state media, that I would just believe everything they said. But now I'm learning from my 15 and 16-year-olds what the world is really about. Another one said, and this one was very powerful. He's a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, a working class neighborhood in Tehran, and his sons have been conscripted into the army. But the sons are joining the protests. And he says he dies of fear every time they join the protests, but at the same time, he can't tell them not to go because it goes against everything that he's taught them from the beginning. So that also speaks to the overwhelming presence of men standing beside women to support their calls for freedom. And that's very important too. And again, unique in this protest movement.
Mm-hmm. What does it take to, I guess, with, Iran is a nuclear powerhouse. And so I think that there's this big fear, right? Everybody's scared of Iran. What will it take for other countries to step in and do something or help or...
Right. So the most important thing is that really what happens is up to the people of Iran. And so they're taking immense risks to make their voices heard, and where this movement goes is up to them. The world has always treated Iran as a nuclear file. So we've been doing this work at the center since 2008. But it's only now that we have the world's attention. Now everyone is posting videos about, violence that's going on inside the country. The negotiations over preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power have been going on for years and years, and that's where coverage has been focused. And what we hear from people that we speak to, years and years ago, there was support for the nuclear deal in Iran. People wanted it to get signed. They wanted relief from sanctions. Now, the strongest supporters are saying, don't sign this deal right now, because they really believe that it gives a green light to the government to continue doing whatever it wants, and then business goes on as usual. And so that speaks a lot to points that we're making at the center. This is part of our advocacy work. What can the world do, you asked? So we really believe that statements of condemnation need to turn into collective action on the international level. And that really needs to begin at the UN. So the UN Human Rights Council needs to set up an urgent special session to discuss events in Iran and establish mechanisms for independent investigation and reporting, and then accountability to hold Iran accountable. UN member states should be issuing collective statements saying that this is not right what Iran is doing, and that the state needs to stop the use of lethal force. The UN, if you can believe it, also has Iran on its main body for gender equality, the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Iran is a member. It should be expelled from this. There are many things that, and states that have relations with Iran can recall their ambassadors and bring them in for questioning. The state and its officials, those representatives that represent the state and not the people, must be made to account and to feel very uncomfortable about what the state is doing. That's where we can begin. And as far as where we can go from there, that's really up to the people of Iran to express their demands of where to go from there.
Can the government there, can they just completely cut off everybody in that country from the internet or the outside world, if you will?
They've poured endless amount of money into technology to sort of insulate the internet. So it's very complicated. There's basically two internets there. There's one that's the censored version that the state allows. And then there's the World Wide Web that people can access through VPNs and technologies that can allow them to circumvent state censorship. So yes, they can, but Iranians also find ways to get around that. And recently, there's been discussions by Elon Musk talking about getting Starlink internet, which is satellite internet, into Iran, which would mean that people can completely bypass the government controls. So there's a lot of work that needs to also be done on that front, and technology companies and world leaders can really take the lead on that to enable Iranians to have access to the internet, because it's really a lifeline, the last lifeline that they have left.
So, I mean, this may seem like as I feel like it might be a silly question, but on social media, a lot of us, we don't know what to do, so we repost things, or we might go to the Center for Human Rights in Iran's social media and repost things that you post. Does that help? Does it help to share these things, or is it just not helping?
In one way, it does, because it's a small action. It's not going to mean that the government is going to come falling down because of it. But on the other side, the Iranian government has spent a lot of time trying to convince the world that it represents the people of Iran, that these other people are just on the fringes of society, or that worse, they try to smear them as agents of foreign states. Literally, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that have come out in just these last few weeks. So how all these people could be agents of foreign states is very difficult to believe, but they still attempt that. So when we put these images out on social media and these videos, and most importantly, the voices of these people on the ground, you're pushing back against that false narrative. So I do think that it's helpful. And I think it's also helpful for Westerners to be able to educate themselves about Iran, not just what's happening in the moment, but its history. That helps us better understand why people are making the demands they are. And that brings me to something I wanted to address. I'm very certain that women that wear the hijab by choice have been very hurt seeing images of women burning their hijab and ripping it off. That is not those women's fault. It's the state's fault, because the state has turned the hijab, which should be a choice, into a tool of political repression. And that's what people are speaking out against. And I think if you think about the statements of support and solidarity all around the world, recently Malala Yousafzai, the Afghan education activist who was shot by the Taliban and who wears the hijab by choice, came out and says that she stands in solidarity with Iranian women, that she will support the movement, and that no one should tell a woman how they should dress or what they should do. And I think that's a really important message to get from all of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a few more questions, but before we do that, we always like to give back and thank our guests for being here. So we asked our guests to choose a Canadian nonprofit that we can give $500 to in your name. And you chose Mums Against Poverty, which provides education, hunger relief, and disaster relief for children worldwide. So thank you for choosing Mums Against Poverty, and we will be giving them $500 in your name. So thank you for that, Jasmine. And it's what you just said about the hijab. We talk about women should have a right to choose what they want to wear, just like in the US right now, we're talking about Roe versus Wade, and women should have the right to choose what to do with their bodies. I find it interesting how the hijab has been turned into this political, thing, or it's like, oh, I've even seen some, pundits on television use it in a way that is really unfair in the way that you just described. Some women choose to wear it, and they like wearing it, and that's fine. And you could really say the same thing about a woman's body and the right to choose. You can, if you want to terminate a pregnancy, you should have the right to do that. And if you don't want to, okay, you should have the right to make that choice too.
Yeah.
When did it become so? So you're saying it's the regime has done this, the government has done this. They have turned this into something that isn't really what it's about.
Right. And I think something else that you're kind of touching upon is it's also turned Iranians against each other. Before all this happened, there was another case of a young writer. Her name is Sepideh Rashno, who was on a bus and sort of accosted because she wasn't wearing the hijab. Allegedly, she wasn't wearing it. She had let it fall to her shoulders. By another woman who was very conservatively dressed in one. And there was a fight, and it got on video, and then it spread viral on Persian social media. And then they arrested Sepideh Rashnu and brought her on TV and made her make some statements. And this is very part of the MO of the Islamic Republic. If you're ever doing something that's publicly criticizing the state or embarrasses the state, almost certainly you're going to be taken in, interrogated, and they're going to force you through various means to make statements on tape, and then state media broadcast those statements. And it's really just about defaming and kind of making this person guilty in the eyes of the public. But at that time, when we were monitoring Persian social media, a lot of people were saying, why are we doing this to each other? Like, this woman and this other woman are fighting against each other when they could be friends sitting across from each other in a cafe because of this thing that the state says has to happen. And so these are what you're talking about are fundamental rights: freedom of religion, freedom of expression, free speech. They all can exist together. And that's what Iranians are calling for and risking everything for, to speak out for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you tell me a little bit about the Center for Human Rights. That where your work is. How did you? So you were born in Iran. You were raised in Vancouver.
Yes.
And now you're in Washington D.C. and you're doing this work. And tell me how you got from here in Vancouver, where I am, to where you are now.
Right. So my family has always been very engaged politically with Iran. My parents were part of the movement that wanted that sovereignty in Iran before the revolution. They absolutely didn't want the dictatorship that came after that. And they suffered political persecution inside the country. And that was one reason why they sought better opportunities outside. And when I came to Canada all those years, I was always watching Iran, learning about it. And when I visited, I was able to really see the country for what it is and how different life is there and here. Just on the simple levels, just something that a Canadian might not understand. It gets really hot in Iran in the summer, but they force you to cover, like even showing that amount of, this amount of skin, like it's too much. So you're supposed to cover yourself. There's just not even any practicality to it. You're sweating. You don't want to be outside. Or women are not allowed to exercise in public around men. And yet I met a woman who came from a religious family when I was in Tehran, and she would dress up as a boy and go bike riding outside at night. The reason she would do that is so that no one would harass her for, why are you, woman, riding your bike? But now the country has changed so much that women are riding motorcycles by themselves and then filming themselves even without a hijab and saying, we can do this, and we're going to show you to the government that we're going to do this no matter what you say, that they don't want to live under the thumb of the state. So it's really, truly beautiful and amazing. But at the same time, I should also emphasize, more than 230 people have been killed, including children. Dozens of children have been killed during these protests. And just to talk about, I left the country when I was very young, but some of these people that have been killed are young teenage girls, like Sarina Esmailzadeh, who is 16 years old, and she would put her views on blogs online, just like any kind of kid connected to the world through social media. And I was haunted by one of these statements that she made. She says, I always wonder why I had to be born in Iran. And it's so heartbreaking to hear that young girl say something like that. And then just not long after, she was killed. So that's why it's so important for not just you, but your colleagues, the world, to keep this focus on Iran. I know it sounds like it's minimal, that it's not going to help because the government isn't falling. But at the same time, it's better to keep that light on Iran like the center does than turn the other way. And in that case, the mass atrocities occur in the darkness. And so you asked what we do at the center. we're a tiny organization with big heart. Many of us are Iranian. Many of us recently came from Iran. We have lawyers and journalists and activists. We operate in Persian and English, and we have many different arms. One is documentation of mass human rights abuses and means of working to hold the Iranian government accountable through institutions like the UN, and hopefully one day the International Criminal Court. And then other things that we do are advocacy. So as I said, connecting with governments around the world to not just treat Iran as a nucleophile, but to really change their policy approach so that it's human focused. Because you can make a deal with this government on the nuclear file, but then if it changes and there's a revolution, then what have you done? Focus on the people, focus on amplifying their demands. Which is something that is very new that's happening now since this protest movement really exploded on the world stage.
The one thing that I can't get out of my mind's eye is the photo of Mahsa's father and the pain in his face. And I saw it on social media. And like you've said during this conversation, if it wasn't for social media, I would have never seen that photo. I would have never known about Mahsa. I would have never seen the prison on fire. But his, I hear a lot of people say that, men in Iran, they don't like women and this is why this happens. But all of these women are someone's sister, daughter, friend, auntie. They're loved by men and women. Right. And so the photo of him is so heartbreaking, and it put that human story to it. It really did.
Yes. And men are side by side with women. Women are leading this movement and men are side by side with them, especially at the universities and even in the high schools. Boys are chanting the same chants that girls are chanting. So really, truly, this is not, again, just like a small movement. It's all of Iranian society. It's just that it's very much focused on the fact that the Iranian government has been trying to uphold its power by really keeping half the population down. Certainly, there's people that benefit from that and will support the state. But more and more, and again, that chant, join us or you'll be the next Mahsa, that really isn't just a chant from women, but it's from men too. They really understand it. And there's a lot of unity happening on the ground in Iran. As I said, provinces, cities, different social classes, different genders standing side by side, and also in the diaspora. Speaking in solidarity.
Yeah. Jasmine, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I want people to know that your Twitter handle is Jasmine, it's Jasmin Ramsey, that's SEY. You can go to the Center for Human Rights in Iran. So that the website is iranhumanrights.org. And all the things that we talked about will be on your website. And again, I thank you for being so open and giving with all this information to help us all understand.
Thanks for having me, Tamara.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.